Yeah, thank you very much for that nice introduction. And I have the honor now to introduce to you the lecturer of tonight, Ivan Krastev, head of the Center for Liberal Studies in Sofia and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, along with distinguished personalities such as Charles Taylor, the Canadian Charles Taylor, of course, and Timothy Snyder. Even you won't remember, but we met several times some 20 years ago in the early or mid-90s. And when journalists and scholars meet, sometimes a bit annoying for the scholars, because the journalists, they have this habit not to listen, but to lurk out the quotations they need for an article that they already have in mind. But that never worked out with you. Every time I came out of your office, I was so full of new ideas and so puzzled that I had to rewrite what I had intended to write before. Unlike many analysts of his generation in Eastern Europe, Ivan has not ended up in politics, and otherwise we would not hear what he has to say about this flood of protests over the world, and that would remain, I think, in closed circles in that case. And instead he became a shooting star in the academic world, though with many ties to political consulting. And you will hardly find an academic institution or a political foundation in that field that hasn't tried to lure him into its advisory board, and most of the time successfully. His most recent book is on Democracy Disrupted, the Politics of Global Protest, and that's exactly on the topic he will talk about. After Ivan's lecture, we will hear 3 out of 4 announced respondents. So they will all do their responding job. First, Florian Bieber, Kerem Öktem, and third, I know whether you've arrived, Eva Maria Freinberger. Is she here?
No.
She's not here yet. And the fourth, Stefan Zotti, was not able to come for whatever reason. So that gives more time for the floor to discuss the ideas that Ivan will now introduce to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're asking yourself why people are doing this lecture. This is because of introductions. You're never going ever to listen to such a nice things about yourself. Secondly, I'm the proper person to talk about university and democracy, because all my life I have been around university, but never very much in, which keeps you always in love with the university. So it was a romantic relationship, but never marriage. Because the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna is a non-teaching institution. It's an institute for advanced studies. But also for me, this is an opportunity, because knowing some of the colleagues who are teaching here, the interesting story with the topic of the protests, which basically erupted in the world in the last 5 or 6 years, is that you have a very different discussions in different places. Because to a certain extent, it's also very much related to different experiences that people have. So what I'm going to start, and I will try to keep my presentation 25-30 minutes, much more basically presenting to you an argument, so after that we can basically discuss it. But behind any research there is a story, and this is the story that provoked your question, and this is the question that basically lead to the research. So here is the story. 2013 looked kind of a boring and predictable year in Bulgaria. It was going to be an election year. The economy was not doing very well. There was a referendum in January where only 25% of the people take part. It was very much on the nuclear power station in Kozloduy. So you have a kind of a high level of disappointment, at the same time a very low political activity. Obviously, people were very mistrustful to the political elites, but you didn't feel any interest for them to re-enter politics. You go with the public opinion polls, and it was there. And then in February, but really now out of nowhere, 100,000 people went on the street protesting against the high electricity bills. It was very unusual. First, because no political parties or trade unions have been involved. It's not simply that they didn't organize the protests. Anytime an opposition political leaders tried to enter the protests, people on the street didn't allow them to join. It was a very strong message. It's not about political parties, it's not about trade unions, but it's not even only politicians. Everybody who was well known from the media was not allowed to go. Secondly, for the first time in the Bulgarian history in the last 25 years, this type of a protest basically happened in the countryside. It was not Sofia. And the message was a kind of a strange message. They even didn't ask for the resignation of the government. They have been only insisting on electricity prices. And I will not go on this story of electricity prices and so on, but it's quite important. And just to imagine the tragic intensity of this protest, which took part several weeks, 7 people burned themselves. And this was a shock. Listen, burning yourself is not simply committing a suicide. And most of these people burned themselves without coming with a very clear political message. This was a kind of despair embodied. Also, when you got on the level of the demands which are going beyond this type of a decrease of the bills of electricity bills, there was no clear political message. It was neither left nor right. People didn't allow political speakers to go and to have major speeches. They were singing songs, and this was a patriotic songs of the 19th century, which you're shocked because what they have in common with the electricity bills. But of course, part of the problem was that electricity bills were coming from the 3 companies, one of them Austrian. All of them have been foreign companies, which basically have been keeping the utility. Basically, this was the private monopolies in the electricity utility business. Just for those who are interested, these companies were not the most to be blamed. They're responsible only for 8% of the price of the electricity. But this is where the imagination of the people went. And the message when they're singing these songs and when they're making their nationalistic message was to the government, we're Bulgarians, you're Bulgarians. Why you're allowing all this to happen? Why you're doing these prices to us? At the first moment, the first night, after having some clashes with the police on the streets, the center-right government of Prime Minister Borisov decided to resign. People on the streets were surprised, because the elections were 4 months away. The government went for resignation. The Prime Minister said, I don't want blood on the streets. But people were also shocked, because they were not so much about resignation of the government. They wanted the price down. And the resignation of the government means that the prices will not go down. This is not what shocked me. So, of course, for every one of us, and don't forget, when you're living outside of your country, you become to be in a certain way much more sensitive for things that you don't understand. Where you're living in a place, you have the false feeling that you understand everything. When you're outside, there are certain things that you are basically shocked. So what shocked me, of course, was this mass protest, and of course the fact that it happened outside of Sofia. But the real shock came when the early elections took place in May. And the shock was the following. In January, before all these mass protests, opinion poll agencies have been doing their predictions how the elections are going to end up. And the results of the elections was exactly as they were predicted in January. If you didn't know that there were protests in Bulgaria of such a scale, if you didn't know that there was basically early elections, you're never going to get it if you're simply following the electoral behavior. So this was the first moment in which, for me, the question came, why this very intensive political protest activity is not translated into electoral behavior? This is, and I'll continue, but this is the question that basically faced me. And then elections were there. the center-right government of a party of Prime Minister Borisov won the elections, but probably also because of the intensity of the protest moment, they didn't manage to form a government, and the new government coalition was a really strange one. You have the Socialist Party, you have the Turkish Minority Party, and you have ATAK, a very extreme nationalistic party. So this was a very strange coalition. But 2 weeks after they formed the government, they did something which was also difficult to explain in any type of logical terms. They decided to appoint as the head of the security apparatus, basically the head of the Bulgarian counterintelligence, a guy who was 34 years old. He was member of the Turkish Minority Party. His mother owns 70% of the media, printed media in the country. The only thing he was known was that he was basically accused in several corruption affairs. He never made a public speech, and he really looked ugly. I'm saying this because this is quite important. This is quite important because aesthetics matters a lot. If this guy looked like George Clooney, probably people were not going on the street. But he basically became the embodiment of all things that people were talking about the political class, and they saw it. He had a bodyguard of 8 persons. He basically had all these cars. Of course, he has a girlfriend, a folk singer. So everything is classics. And you never can understand why this counterintelligence agency, which basically normally is created in order to go after people like him, is going to become the head of it. As a result of it, when it was announced, the same night, 100,000 people went on the street. Only social media, no political parties being involved, no trade unions. Their first message was basically the guy should go out. For 24 hours, the government was pretending that they can live with the protests. 48 hours later, he resigned. But then, basically, the people on the street said, no, he resigned, but we also want the government that have an idea that they can appoint a person like this to resign too. And for the next 400 days, there was everyday Bulgarians on the street. Some days you have tens of thousands, some days you have 600-700, but every day. And this is not the most interesting part of it. The most interesting part is that not a single political speech had been done in these 400 days. Nobody was speaking. People have been simply walking. No kind of a major political demand beyond this resignation of the government has been done. The group was quite heterogeneous. They didn't allow the opposition parties, trade unions, or any major other players to become part of the protests. And then we have the elections after the government decided to resign after a major banking scandal. And if you don't know that these 400 days were there, you're never going to get it. Not a single important new party had been created. Nothing really happened on the level of the electoral behavior. And even the electoral turnout was not very high. So this is where I'm coming from. For me, the problem is not simply the protests, the protest experience. As you know, these days, there is quite a lot of literature on the global protest in different places. And it's a lot of literature, and most of them being written of people that have been on the streets themselves. So from this point of view, it's very much participant kind of a driven literature. But this is not what I'm interested in. For me, the most interesting question was, what does it mean for democracy, the fact that the protest experience and electoral experiences have been so much divorced? We are now going to start, I do believe, a big project in the Institute in Vienna called Ballots, Courts and Streets, trying to understand under what kind of conditions, what kind of social groups are looking for political change through the electoral system, through the courts, and through the street protests. But for me, this was the interesting, and this is where basically I come from. Just in order to understand that this is not a Bulgarian-related case, for the last 7 years, there was protests like this, similar, of course, you know. It's different from country to country. In some places, of course, parties were more involved than others. But in 75 countries in the world, you have mass political protests. We are talking about millions of people on the street. It's not new to have people on the street. This is the story. People used to be on the street when it comes to politics. What is new is that the political parties was not the one mostly getting them on the street anymore. And of course, there was a lot of talk about social media, and I'm going to touch on this, how this worked or not. Interesting story is that with very few exceptions, and I'm going to touch on the problem of Podemos, most of this protest explosion and these protest movements didn't end up in the ballot box. No political parties, no kind of a major political leaders being born out of this. So my question was, what? What does it mean for the democratic politics, and not what does it mean for the protests? So let's start with the election. There is a beautiful novel, and I do believe that art is still very important if you want to understand politics. This is a novel written in 2004 by the Nobel Prize winner José Saramago. And the novel is called Seeing. The plot of the novel is the following. In a small country, it could be your country, on election day, people went to vote, and strangely it appeared that 75% of the people voted with a blank ballot. The government was shocked. They see this as a conspiracy. The problem was that it was very difficult to understand who organized the conspiracy. The police basically started interrogations and others, but there was no organization. It looked as if, in one and the same moment, 75% of the population came up with the same idea, that they're going to vote with a blank ballot. So the government doesn't know what to do. They ask for new elections, and on these new elections, 83% of the people voted blank vote. Why I'm saying this? Because there was an empirical study being done by an Italian colleague of ours, which was based on comparing the Basque country in Spain on the national elections and municipal election in Italy, which shows that individual black ballot is the best expression of the disappointment with the political system compared with any other exception of the protest voting. I mean, abstention, or basically collective type of crossing the bulletins and others. And it appeared that it's very characteristics for the most educated part of the electorate. Basically, she was very much empirically studying which parts of the cities this type of a black vote was so high. I'm saying this because to a certain extent, some of the protest eruption that we saw in the last years is very much the revolution of the blankers, the people who basically normally go with the blank vote. It was very much anti-institutional. There was not a very concrete political demands. There was not the idea to try to form a positive agenda. Most of these people was not about power. There was much more about control of the power. And it was not simply mistrust to this party or that party. It was about the political system. And one of the major kind of messages coming from Spain, coming from other parts, and it's quite interesting that these protests were taking place in democracies and not democracies alike, in countries that have been hurt by the economic crisis stuff, but also crises that were doing fairly well during the economic crisis, like Brazil, where normally, or even Turkey, it was not basically the economy that is going to explain what happened. So I believe this is quite important, and of course there was an attempt to try to get this as a global phenomena, and there was two types of a major explanation, three. The first was Paul Mason, very well-known British journalist who have been covering most of this type of a protests, who basically said, we on the left have been waiting for this to happen for such a long time, and now it happened. You have a global anti-capitalist revolution, all these people are there. The major figure in this protest is the graduate without future. People who got great education, but they are not getting a great job perspectives. But if you go closer to some of the sociological profiles, it is more complex than this. And of course it can explain especially the position and the protest in some places like Spain and others. It is not going to fit so easily, for example, in places like Brazil. And then you have Fukuyama, who basically said, no, it's not negative, it's very positive. This is the revolution of the global middle class, which is now much more market-oriented than state-oriented. They went for against corruption, for transparency. This is not the crisis of capitalism, this is the triumph of capitalism. This also sounds kind of interesting, but if you basically read what people are saying on the street, I don't believe that the triumph of capitalism was what they're really fighting for. And then, of course, you have the people who said, it's the technology, stupid. Everything is about social media. It's social media which allows people very easily to organize, to get information, and this is the social media who empowered people. They don't need political parties anymore. Direct democracy can work. So basically, this is what explains why there are no parties, crowds, but there are citizens. This is important, and of course social media play a very important role, but there is, in my view, extremely interesting argument coming from a young Turkish scholar, Zeynep Tüfekçi. And she's making an argument about social media which I find very important. She said on one level, of course, social media very much empowers, but now when this protests over, and when some of them did not succeed, people start to try to understand, could there be a dark side of the social media too? And of course, in the Turkish case, this was quite important, because after falling in love with the social media, the story is there limits for the empowering of the social media. First of all, the idea that people are gaining out of the social media and governments are basically the losers, this is something which you should be very strongly naive to believe. Because in the same way, basically, the new social media allows people to organize and to discuss, it also allows the government to surveil. What is even more important, some of the governments are much more sophisticated than people believe. For example, in China, you don't have a suppression of complaints. If you're going to complain about, for example, misbehavior of the Chinese official, Chinese authorities are not going to ban, for example, your tweet, because for them this is a very important feedback, how system works. They're banning you when you try to organize. You can complain as much as you want. The only problem is you're not going to be allowed to organize. So from this point of view, you have a much more sophisticated also government side. But her major argument is, in my view, very important, because she claims the following. She uses a beautiful metaphor, so I'm going to retell this metaphor because I do believe it's an important one. As you know, these days, much more people are climbing Everest than ever before. But in the last 10 years, the number of people dying on the climbing of Everest has increased disproportionately. One of the reasons is that before, people who are climbing Everest have been real professionals. Before it, they have been climbing mountain top after mountain top. Now, for $65,000, you basically can, with the support of the technology and the Sherps, you can basically end up very close to the top. But then you have this Hillary step, and you have this last 1 or 2 days of climbing, which looks easy, but it looks easy only because you have never done it. And people start dying. Because, she claims, the fact that you have this new technology and this easiness to end up there, end up with a totally unprepared people trying to do Everest. The same is happening with the social movements. The social media allowed these movements to pick up too early. They didn't manage to create organizational capacity. They didn't manage to create internal cohesion. So as a result of it, they're very easily getting the political attention, but then it's much more difficult for them to stay on and to make political impact. So her argument is, yes, social media creates additional capacity and basically empowers citizens in politics, but also, like everything else, like any technology, it has a cost. And this cost is also disempowering, because basically it makes much more difficult to develop this type of organizational capacity that is so important for making impact in politics. Because you can tweet a revolution, but you cannot tweet a transition. And this was very clearly seen in the case, for example, of Egypt, where the best organized forces on the ground were the ones that basically succeeded. So this is basically these three major explanations that are trying to give the idea why the protests erupted, are they successful or not successful, and how to read them. As I told you, my interest was different. To go and to see protests and elections. Why people lost the feeling that elections matter. And we're talking about democratic countries with competitive elections. Now I'm not discussing Russia, I'm not discussing basically place where basically situation is very different. And as a result of it, I'll try to see what is the role in the elections in politics outside of everything that we know that you're electing a government. One of the important things about election in politics is that they're regular, which means that no elections is final. You always know that they're going to be a next round. So as a result of it, it's very important basically to know that it's not a zero-sum game. Even if you're going to lose this time, basically they're going to be a next time. And this was very much how the political life has been regulated, because you're a loser, but you're never an absolute loser when it comes to the election politics. The second important thing is the elections are very much arranging our idea of time. Imagine a guy who comes in our countries, in a democratic country, and this guy or girl does not have a clue what is elections, and he does not know, do we live in a pre-election or post-election period? He's not going to understand much. He's going to be very much lost while politicians are doing this or that. In a strange way, the elections are very much, at least probably falsely, making the actions of politicians understandable to us exactly because they divide the political space on pre-elections and post-elections, where basically you believe that understand what they're doing, what they're not doing. But what is very important about elections is not also what you represent, but also what you misrepresent. Part of the trick of the elections always was that it tries to energize the apathetic part of the public, but also to pacify the most militant and zealot. Listen, when we go to vote, you who really care about these elections and me who doesn't care much, we have one vote. So those who are really very intense, they don't have a chance, their intensity to be translated. And those who basically don't care much, basically they're pushed more and more to take part in politics. This was all this game that was making our kind of democratic societies working, because democracy was always a very important, democracy always claims that society is in crisis. This is basically, discourse of democracy is always discourse of crisis, and Tocqueville very basically noticed this. But democratic politics was always a mixture of dramatization and trivialization. First of all, every election is the most important ever elections. And politicians are telling you that it is on these elections that everything is going to be decided. And they're all the time telling you that the problems that we're facing are totally dramatic. But then the election is over, and it appeared that these dramatic problems are not so dramatic, and in a certain way we're back to the normal. So this type of a game of dramatization and trivialization was very important to make this type of a democratic balance. So from this point of view, something happened. And strangely enough, elections became disappointed experiences both for the citizens but also for the political elites. And I'm just going to sketch why, in my view, this is happening in order to go to my last point. Why for the elites? Listen, because the elections are not giving clear mandates these days anymore. Out of the 34 OECD countries, we have only 4 at the moment which have a majority government. All others are coalition governments, so from this point of view, you basically never have a clear idea to do this or that. It's always going to be something different. And politicians don't have the feeling anymore that the elections are giving them assurance that voters are going to support them when they go with certain policies. Before, the relations between the politician and the voter was like a Catholic marriage. Even if you don't like each other, you stay with each other for a long time. Now, for example, Hollande was elected. 6 months later, he lost 30% of his support. Elections is not guaranteeing that basically citizens are going to stay with you. And basically the politicians, from this point of view, for them this was a major and important kind of advantage of the elections. The second thing that elections are not doing anymore, they are not neutralizing the opposition. Because before you're elected, and the message to the opposition is, guys, you're going to stay for the next 3 or 4 years quiet, because basically you have a mandate to govern. Look at the United States. Because of the fact that you don't have a clear mandate, basically the message of the Republicans is, we are minority, but the presidential party is also minority. So from this point of view, we're not going to basically take your position and your victory for legitimate enough. And then, from the point of view of governing, the elections are basically starting to lose this attractiveness that they have. But then we go to the citizens. And we have been discussing this with respect to the Balkans already in the 1990s. people, this was before very true for the transition countries, I do believe it's now true for all the European Union, have the feeling that they can change governments, but they cannot change economic policies. Because this is part of the cost of European integration, positive cost, but in order for the euro to exist, we are basically constitutionalizing economic decision-making. Basically, we're constitutionalizing budget deficits. So more and more economic decisions are taken out of the electoral politics. In the same way, by the way, the foreign policy was taken out of the electoral politics during the Cold War. But then people said, we're changing governments all the time, and we're getting the same politics and the same policies. Why to vote? There is a colleague of mine with whom I have been writing together quite a lot, Stephen Holmes, who had a point which I find very important. He said, democracy does not work in a society where the stakes are either very high or very low. For example, if what is at stake is a war, like in Afghanistan and Iraq, ballots are not enough. You basically need guns to defend yourself. But if also the stakes are very low, if basically nothing important is decided on the elections, why to vote? And also people start to have the feeling that they're electing a government, but this government is not important anymore. By the way, the governments also learn this. So these days the government's explaining to the people what they cannot do. Strangely enough, before the government's always pretending that they're stronger than they are. Now they basically pretend that they are weaker than they are. This is a kind of a competition in impotence. The government is all that they say, listen, but we cannot do this, believe us, we cannot do anything. But if you don't believe anything, why somebody should vote at all? And I do believe this very kind of an important situation created this crisis in which we see basically not simply political parties, but elections as a very critical element of the democratic system, losing its appeal, both for the political elites, but for the publics. And then comes my last question. Why then people have the feeling that the elections disempower them, but protests empowers them, keeping in mind that they didn't succeed much with the protests. Neither the price of electricity these days are lower than they have been, nor basically, of course, this guy is not head of the counterintelligence anymore, but he's a very important part of the political elite, once again in the parliament. So what gives the people feeling that protests matter? Why they believe that this is an effective instrument? Because normally people don't do things that don't make sense. Probably you have seen it. If people are doing something, it makes sense. The problem is to understand basically for whom and what kind of sense here. So here I'm basically going to finish with the 5 things that I do believe makes protests so attractive. One is experience. You're on the street, there are other people, and this is something that you're going to remember. You don't remember for whom you have voting, but you remember that you have been on the streets with other people. You remember how important you are. And this idea of a citizen, by the way, abstract citizen, is so important for you that you're doing something that makes sense. Secondly, if you don't know where power is, better go on the street, because you're challenging the power, nevertheless, where it is. In Bosnia, the biggest decision that the protesters should take was in front of which building to protest, because there were too many buildings. And also, this type of a protest, they have a global appeal. Nevertheless, how Bulgarians vote, they're never going to end on CNN. But at the moment when they go on the streets, you're immediately part of a global media attention. And as a result of it, you're not simply putting pressure on your local elite, but you're also in a certain way eroding the solidarity on the global elite. Basically, because of the media saying this and that, the governments of these countries also push to take position of what's happening in this country. So I'm going to stop here because it's too long, and I do believe that during the discussion I can make my argument clear. I do believe from this point of view that protest is very important, and they're very important exactly because of the kind of a crisis of elections and not simply the crisis of political parties. What I don't believe and what I cannot see an argument for is that this type of street protests at the moment bringing a major political change. So from this point of view, strangely enough, the protests like the elections can end up being a mechanism for legitimizing a certain type of a status quo, which is unacceptable for everybody, but which basically not many people can offer an alternative to. So, thank you. Yeah.